Write in the comments which country you're watching from and which sultan fascinates you the most. If you're interested in the hidden stories of the Ottoman Empire, subscribe to the channel. History remembers victors, but what of a victor who dies at the very moment of his triumph? Imagine a battlefield soaked in blood, the clash of steel finally silencing. An empire is born from the ashes of this brutal victory. But its architect, Sultan Murad I, will not see the dawn. As he walks amongst the fallen, a lone figure rises, not in surrender, but with a hidden blade. This is the story of the only sultan in history to be assassinated on the battlefield, a tale of conquest, faith, and a death that would echo for centuries. In the rugged heartlands of 14th century Anatolia, a new power was stirring. It was not an empire of ancient lineage, but a frontier state, a whirlwind of ambition forged in the crucible of faith and fire. This was the Beylik of Osman, and its soul was the spirit of the Ghazi, the holy warrior for Islam. To be a Ghazi was to live on the edge of Christendom, to see the world as a battleground between belief and unbelief, and to find glory not in gold, but in conquest. Into this world, in the year 1326, a prince was born. His name was Murad. He was the son of Orhan Ghazi and the grandson of the dynasty's founder, Osman. From his first breath, Murad did not inhale the perfumed air of a settled court, but the dust of the campaign trail, the scent of horse and steel. He grew up not in palaces, but in sprawling military camps that were cities on the move. His lullabies were the call to prayer and the sharpening of swords. His lessons were taught not by scholars in quiet libraries, but by grizzled veterans who mapped out Byzantine fortresses in the dirt with a stick. The legacy he was set to inherit was a heavy one. His grandfather Osman had been a dream chaser, a tribal leader who saw in a vision a great tree growing from his body to shelter the world. His father Orhan was the architect, the one who turned that dream into a state. He captured the great city of Bursa, minted the first Ottoman coins, and organized the first standing army. Orhan transformed a band of nomadic warriors into a disciplined, expansionist power. Murad watched, and he learned. He saw how his father balanced ruthless conquest with shrewd administration. He understood that power was not simply taken. It had to be held, organized, and legitimized. The shadow of the Ghazi was long and demanding. It promised eternal glory for the faithful, but it also demanded constant struggle, sacrifice, and an unyielding will. For a young prince like Murad, it was both a birthright and a burden, a destiny that would pull him toward the setting sun, toward the crumbling walls of a dying empire, and toward a fate written in blood on a field of blackbirds. Destiny, for an Ottoman prince, was a treacherous path. The throne was not a gift passed gently from father to son. It was a prize to be seized, often from the grasp of one's own kin. Murad learned this lesson with brutal clarity. His elder brother, Suleiman Pasha, was the heir apparent, a celebrated warrior who had led the first Ottoman forces across the Dardanelles into Europe. He was the future. But in 1357, that future was abruptly extinguished. The official story was a hunting accident, a fatal fall from his horse. But in the corridors of power, whispers suggested a more convenient and permanent removal. With Suleiman gone, Murad, then governor of Bursa, was thrust into the forefront. When his father Orhan died 2 years later, in 1359, the moment of truth arrived. The Ottoman way was one of merciless political calculus. A divided house could not stand against the wolves at its borders, the Byzantines, the rival Turkish beyliks, the crusading armies of Europe. The state demanded a single, undisputed master. Any challenge, any rival claim, had to be cauterized before it could fester into civil war. Murad's younger brothers, Ibrahim and Halil, represented just such a threat. They had their own ambitions, their own followers. Upon ascending the throne, Murad's first act was not one of celebration, but of brutal consolidation. He moved with chilling speed. His brothers were captured and, under the grim logic of state preservation, executed. It was a practice that would become a dark tradition within the House of Osman, a state-sanctioned fratricide seen as a necessary evil to prevent the greater evil of internal collapse. This was not the act of a bloodthirsty tyrant, but of a cold pragmatist who understood the unforgiving nature of the world he inhabited. With their deaths, Murad sent a terrifying message to all who would challenge him. There is only one sultan. The throne was now his, secured not by law or tradition alone, but forged in the blood of his own family. He stood alone, the undisputed ruler, his authority absolute, his hands stained but his state united, ready to turn his undivided attention to the enemies beyond his borders. With his rule secured by the sword, Murad turned his gaze eastward to the complex and treacherous tapestry of Anatolia. This was the Turkish heartland, a mosaic of competing principalities, or beyliks, each ruled by proud dynasties who saw the upstart Ottomans as equals, not masters. To Murad, this was an unacceptable state of affairs. A divided Anatolia was a weak Anatolia, vulnerable to Mongol threats from the east and Byzantine manipulation from the west. His vision was singular, unification under the Ottoman banner. But Murad was more than just a conqueror. He was a master of statecraft. He understood that the Turkish beyliks could not always be subdued by force alone. They were fellow Muslims, fellow Turks. To wage open war on them was to risk being branded a tyrant, a betrayer of the faith. So, he employed a subtler, more patient strategy, a masterful blend of coercion, diplomacy, and dynastic marriage. He moved against his most persistent rival, the powerful Karamanid dynasty, with calculated military campaigns, chipping away at their territory and influence piece by piece. He asserted his dominance not as a foreign conqueror, but as the preeminent Ghazi leader, the one most capable of championing the Islamic cause. Where the sword was too blunt an instrument, he used the silken ties of marriage. He arranged for his son, the fiery Prince Bayezid, to marry the daughter of the ruler of Germian. The dowry was not gold or jewels, but land, vast strategic territories, including the city of Kütahya, handed over to the Ottomans without a single drop of blood being shed. He purchased other territories from the Hamidids. Slowly, methodically, he was absorbing Anatolia. Each conquest, each treaty, each marriage was a deliberate step toward a unified Turkish state under his command. He was transforming the Ottoman principality from a frontier state into the nucleus of an empire, building a secure foundation in the east before he would unleash his full fury upon the west. Anatolia was being tamed, not just by fear, but by the undeniable gravity of Murad's ambition and political genius. While Murad patiently assembled his Anatolian puzzle, his gaze was fixed across the water, on the fertile plains and fractured kingdoms of the Balkans. Europe was a prize of unimaginable wealth and prestige, the heartland of his Byzantine rival. His father's warriors had established a foothold at Gallipoli, a dagger pointed at the throat of Thrace. Now, Murad would push that dagger in. In 1362, his veteran commander, Lala Shahin Pasha, accomplished the unthinkable. He captured the great city of Adrianople, the second city of the Byzantine Empire. This was no mere border raid. It was a seismic shift in the balance of power. Murad immediately recognized its significance. He moved his capital from Bursa in Asia to Adrianople, now renamed Edirne, in Europe. The message was unmistakable and terrifying to the Christian world. The Ottomans were not visitors. They were here to stay. From this new European capital, the waves of conquest crashed deeper into the Balkans. Thrace fell, then Macedonia. The Ottomans were a relentless tide, their disciplined janissaries and swift Sipahi cavalry overwhelming the feudal levies of the bickering Balkan princes. The Bulgarian and Serbian empires, once mighty, were now decaying and fragmented, incapable of mounting a united defense. They fell to Murad one by one, some conquered outright, others forced into humiliating vassalage, their kings compelled to pay tribute and send soldiers to fight in the Sultan's army. But as the Ottoman crescent rose higher over the Balkans, a new spirit of resistance began to stir. Whispers turned into war councils. From the mountains of Serbia and the forests of Bosnia, a coalition was forming. Led by the Serbian Prince Lazar, the Christian lords of the Balkans began to see that they would not be picked off individually. They understood that Murad was not just another raider, but an existential threat to their faith, their culture, and their very existence. A final, desperate alliance was forged. They would gather their strength, unite their armies, and make one last stand to drive the Turk from Europe. The whispers from the west were becoming a roar of defiance, a storm gathering that was destined to break upon a single field in Kosovo. The Byzantine eagle, once the master of 1,000 cities, was now a creature of clipped wings, confined to the gilded cage of Constantinople. Its dominion over the Balkans had fractured, its authority bleeding away with every passing year. And into this vacuum of power stepped Murad. He saw not just a land of plunder, but a land of destiny. His gaze was fixed upon a prize that was more than a city. It was a symbol, a key. Adrianople. Founded by the Roman Emperor Hadrian, it was the gateway to Europe, the mighty fortress that commanded the plains of Thrace. To hold Adrianople was to hold a dagger to the throat of the Balkans and a lock on the door behind you. The campaigns of 1361 were not mere raids. They were a calculated, inexorable advance. Murad's commanders, Lala Shahin Pasha and Evrenos Bey, were not wild horsemen seeking tribute. They were the architects of a permanent conquest. They isolated the city, severing its supply lines and its connections to the ghost empire in Constantinople. The Byzantines, embroiled in their own dynastic squabbles and reliant on unreliable Genoese mercenaries, could offer no meaningful resistance. The city's fall was not a dramatic, prolonged siege in the classic sense. It was the culmination of strategic strangulation. When Murad's forces finally entered the city in 1369, it was a moment that redrew the map of the world. This was not the sack of a foreign town. It was the acquisition of a future home. The crescent flag rising over the ancient Roman walls was a declaration. The Ottomans were no longer guests in Europe. They were masters. They had crossed the threshold, not as fleeting conquerors, but as a power that had come to stay. The psychological shockwave rippled across Christendom. The gate had been breached, and the guardian was now inside. To conquer a city is an act of war. To make it your capital is an act of empire. Murad I understood this with a profound, almost instinctual clarity. Bursa, his Asian capital, was the heart of the old Beylik, a reminder of his dynasty's origins as frontier warriors. But Adrianople, rechristened Edirne, was a statement of its future. It was a pivot, a deliberate turning of the empire's face towards Europe. The decision was audacious, a supreme act of political confidence. Murad was planting his standard firmly on European soil, transforming his state from an Anatolian principality with European possessions into a truly European power. The city itself began to change, its soul remade in the Ottoman image. The great churches were not all destroyed. Many were converted, their bell towers giving way to slender minarets from which the muezzin's call to prayer now echoed across the Thracian plain. Murad commissioned the construction of mosques, sprawling palace complexes, covered bazaars, and public baths. Edirne was not to be a mere military garrison. It was to become a vibrant center of Islamic civilization and imperial administration. This was state building on a grand scale. By moving his court, his treasury, and the heart of his government to Edirne, Murad achieved two critical objectives. First, he solidified his control over the newly conquered Balkan territories, placing his power directly at their center. He could now project force into Serbia, Bulgaria, and Greece with terrifying speed. Second, he sent an unmistakable message to the world. The Ottoman presence in Europe was permanent and irreversible. They were no longer raiding from across the Dardanelles. They were ruling from within. Edirne became the crucible where a nomadic warrior dynasty was forged into a settled, sophisticated imperial power, a European sultanate with ambitions that now knew no bounds. An empire built on conquest requires an army of unparalleled discipline. The old tribal levies, the Turkish horsemen who had served his father and grandfather, were loyal to their clans and their beys as much as to the sultan. Their loyalty could be conditional. Murad needed an instrument of power that answered to him and him alone, a force forged in his fire, with no memory, no family, and no allegiance but to the person of the sultan. From this brutal, pragmatic necessity, the Janissary Corps was born. The system was called the Devshirme, the gathering. Periodically, Ottoman officers would travel through the Christian villages of the Balkans and levy attacks of sons. The strongest, brightest, and most handsome boys, often between the ages of 8 and 14, were taken from their families. It was a calculated act of psychological warfare and state engineering. These children were transported to the capital, forcibly converted to Islam, and stripped of their native tongue and identity. They were, in essence, reborn as children of the state. Their father was the sultan. Their family was the corps. Their life was one of relentless training in the arts of war and unquestioning obedience. They were taught that their past was gone, and their only path to glory, wealth, and power lay in absolute devotion to their master. They were slaves, yes, but they were the most elite slaves in the world, destined to become the highest-ranking generals and administrators of the empire. This paradox created the most formidable infantry in the medieval world. The Janissaries were a standing army, professional and disciplined, at a time when European monarchs relied on feudal levies. They were the sultan's personal property, a human wall around his throne and the steel tip of his spear on the battlefield. They were a terrifyingly effective tool, but in their creation, Murad had sown the seeds of a power that would one day challenge the sultans themselves. The image of Murad I that endures is that of the warrior, the relentless Ghazi king, his sword stained with the blood of infidels on the fields of Kosovo. But this image, while true, is incomplete. A conquest, however brilliant, is fleeting if not consolidated by law, administration, and institutions. An army can win a territory, but only a state can hold it. Murad was as much a founder as he was a conqueror. He wielded the pen with the same strategic acumen as the sword. As his domains swelled, engulfing vast new lands and peoples, he recognized that the informal rule of a frontier principality was no longer sufficient. He needed a bureaucracy. It was under Murad that the office of the Grand Vizier rose to prominence, becoming the second most powerful position in the empire. He found in the Sandalı family a dynasty of brilliant administrators who became the architects of the Ottoman state, organizing the government, the treasury, and the judiciary. It was during his reign that the foundations of the Timar system were solidified. This was a feudal arrangement of genius, where cavalry officers were granted lands and the right to tax them in exchange for military service. It sustained a massive army without draining the central treasury and helped pacify conquered territories. He established the Divan, the imperial council, as the central organ of government, where matters of war, law, and finance were debated and decided. He was a patron of scholars, architects, and jurists, understanding that an empire's legitimacy rests not just on might, but on a high culture and a recognized system of justice. Murad was building the vessel of the state. He was creating the structures that would contain and channel the explosive energy of the Ottoman conquests, ensuring that what was won by the sword would be held and governed by the pen for centuries to come. He was crafting the enduring machinery of empire. The Balkans were not a land to be conquered. They were a storm to be weathered. For Murad, the Ghazi king who had crossed the Hellespont with divine purpose, this land had become a recurring nightmare. Every victory was a seed for a future rebellion. Every subjugated prince was a potential traitor, smiling to his face while sharpening a knife in the shadows. The conquest of Adrianople had given him a European capital, but it had also plunged him into a labyrinth of ancient feuds, treacherous mountains, and a spirit of defiance as hard as the Balkan rock itself. His campaigns were no longer swift, glorious charges. They were grinding, brutal affairs. The capture of Niš in 1386 was a major triumph, driving a wedge deep into the heart of the Serbian and Bulgarian lands. But it was a victory paid for in blood and exhaustion. The Sultan's army, once a force of pure momentum, now had to contend with guerrilla warfare in dense forests, with harsh, unforgiving winters that froze the spirit as much as the body, and with a coalition of Christian lords finding a common cause in their shared hatred of the Turk. At the heart of this resistance was a man who mirrored Murad's own iron will, Prince Lazar Hrebeljanović of Serbia. Lazar was no mere nobleman. He was the vessel of his people's hope, a shrewd diplomat and a formidable warrior who was painstakingly forging a Christian alliance. He sent letters to the kings of Bosnia and Hungary, to the lords of Albania and Wallachia, warning that Murad's ambition was a fire that would consume them all if they did not unite to quench it. For Murad, this was the ultimate challenge. He was no longer fighting disparate warlords. He was facing a nation, an idea, embodied by one man. The Balkan nightmare was taking shape, coalescing into a single epic confrontation that Murad knew was inevitable. The final battle for the soul of the Balkans was drawing near. While Murad's gaze was fixed on the storm gathering in the Balkans, the most venomous threat was breeding within his own palace, in the heart of his own family. A conqueror's greatest fear is not the enemy at the gates, but the serpent in his house. For Murad, that serpent was his own son, Savcı Bey. Left to govern the European capital of Bursa while his father campaigned, Savcı was a prince drowning in his father's shadow. He saw Murad as a relic of a nomadic past, a man obsessed with a bloody, endless war, while he, Savcı, represented a new generation, one that understood the settled life of cities and courts. His ambition, curdled by impatience, became a poison, and he found a kindred spirit in another resentful son, Andronikos Palaiologos, the heir to the Byzantine throne. The Byzantine emperor, John V, was Murad's vassal, a humiliated figurehead. His son Andronikos shared Savcı's contempt for his father's weakness. In secret, the two princes forged an unholy alliance. An Ottoman and a Byzantine, a Muslim and a Christian, united by the singular, primal desire to overthrow their fathers and seize power for themselves. They raised the banner of rebellion in 1373, gathering disgruntled soldiers and mercenaries to their cause. When the news reached Murad on campaign, it struck him with the force of a physical blow. This was not war. This was sacrilege. It was a betrayal of blood, of dynasty, of the sacred order of father and son. The external enemy could be fought with honor, but this internal corruption had to be excised with merciless precision. Murad abandoned his Balkan campaign, turning his army around with a speed born of pure fury. The battle against Lazar could wait. First, he had to deal with the serpent he had sired. The rebellion of the sons was short-lived. Murad's rage was a force of nature, and against it, the half-formed ambitions of Savcı and Andronikos stood no chance. The rebel army was cornered and crushed near Constantinople. But for Murad, victory on the battlefield was not the end. It was the beginning of a terrible reckoning. This was a lesson that had to be carved into the very memory of his dynasty. Savcı Bey was brought before his father in chains. We can only imagine the scene: the triumphant, aging sultan and the defeated, defiant son. Was there a plea for mercy? Was there a flicker of paternal love in Murad's eyes? History records only the judgment, a sentence of chilling, symbolic cruelty. Murad ordered his own son to be blinded. He would not kill him, not yet. He would first extinguish the light from his eyes, the very windows through which he had viewed his father's throne with such avarice. It was a punishment designed to horrify, a message to his other sons, Bayezid and Yakub, that the price of treason was a living death. But Murad's vengeance was not yet sated. He turned his cold fury upon his vassal, the Byzantine Emperor John V. He forced the emperor to inflict the very same punishment upon his own co-conspirator son, Andronikos. the father must blind the son. It was the ultimate assertion of dominance, a horrifying spectacle of power that made the Byzantine court a mere extension of Murad's will. With this single, brutal act, Murad cauterized the wound of rebellion. He had demonstrated that no bond, not even that of father and son, was more sacred than the security of the state and the authority of the Sultan. He had preserved his empire, but in the process, he had been forced to become a monster to his own blood. The father in him may have wept, but the Sultan did not flinch. By the late 1380s, Murad stood at the apex of his power, yet he had never been more alone. He was a man who had conquered cities, shattered kingdoms, and even commanded a father to blind his own son. But each victory, each act of brutal necessity, had built another stone in the wall of his isolation. The Ghazi companions of his youth were mostly gone, replaced by administrators and generals who served him out of fear as much as loyalty. He looked at his remaining sons and saw his own chilling lesson reflected in their eyes. In Bayezid, he saw a fiery, reckless ambition that both impressed and worried him. In Yaqub, a quiet intelligence that was perhaps even more dangerous. He had taught them that the throne was worth any price, and now he had to live with the consequences of that lesson, sleeping with one eye open, trusting no one completely. The weight of his growing empire was immense. He was no longer just a warrior king leading raids, but the architect of a state, a lawgiver, a judge. The thrill of the charge had been replaced by the endless burden of rule. The world he had built was held together by his will alone. And now that will was about to be tested one final time. From across the Balkans, Lazar's coalition had finally materialized. Serbs, Bosnians, Albanians, Wallachians, Hungarians, Poles, a vast Christian army was assembling on the plains of Kosovo, the field of blackbirds. This was to be the final argument. For Murad, it was the culmination of his life's work, the ultimate validation of his divine mission. As he prepared his army to march, the aging Sultan was a solitary figure. He was a father who had destroyed his child, a master of vassals who trusted no friend, a conqueror who had gained a world but was now utterly, profoundly alone with his destiny. In the courts and castles of the Balkans, a cold dread had taken root. It was the fear of a power that did not negotiate, that did not respect old borders or ancient crowns. The Ottoman tide, which had once seemed a distant storm on the Anatolian horizon, was now crashing against the very gates of Christian Europe. Sultan Murad's victory at Plochnik had been a brutal awakening. The individual princes and kings, long consumed by their own rivalries and petty squabbles, now faced a chilling reality. Divided, they would be devoured. The architect of resistance was Prince Lazar Hrebeljanović of Serbia. He was no emperor, but he possessed a gravitas and a foresight that commanded respect. He understood that pride and old grievances were luxuries they could no longer afford. He sent emissaries not just to his Serbian vassals, but far beyond, carrying messages not of supplication, but of shared destiny. His most crucial appeal was to Tvutko I, the powerful king of Bosnia. Their relationship had been fraught with tension, a chess match of regional power. But Lazar's plea transcended politics. He spoke of a threat to their shared faith, their people, their very world. Tvutko, recognizing the existential nature of the Ottoman advance, committed his finest general, Vlatko Vuković, and a formidable contingent of Bosnian knights. Lazar's son-in-law, Vuk Branković, a powerful lord in his own right, rallied his forces. Knights from Wallachia, Albania, and even a contingent of Polish and Hungarian volunteers answered the call. A fragile, desperate alliance was forged in the shadow of the dragon. It was a coalition born not of friendship, but of necessity. A league of sworn enemies and wary allies, now bound by a single terrifying purpose: to stand together against Murad's seemingly invincible war machine, or to perish alone. The spring of 1389 saw the mobilization of two worlds. From Edirne, the heart of his European domains, Sultan Murad I began his march. This was not merely an army, it was an empire on the move. At its core were the Janissaries, the slave soldiers, raised to know no loyalty but to the Sultan, their discipline forged in a crucible of faith and steel. Flanking them were the Sipahi cavalry, feudal lords and their retainers, whose land was granted in exchange for war. There were the Akinci, the light cavalry raiders who were the eyes and ears of the host, and the Azabs, the irregular infantry. It was a multi-ethnic, multilingual force, drawn from Anatolia and Rumelia, united under the green banners of Islam and the personal authority of their warrior sultan. Their advance was slow, deliberate, inexorable, a river of steel and men carving its way through the valleys of the Balkans. In response, the lands of the South Slavs stirred with a different kind of energy. From the forests of Bosnia, the hills of Serbia, and the plains of Kosovo, men gathered. Prince Lazar's summons had been answered. Knights clad in heavy plate armour, the pride of the Balkan nobility, assembled alongside peasant levies armed with spears and axes. It was a more heterogeneous force, a patchwork of banners representing different lords, each with their own traditions and loyalties. They gathered at Nish, a confluence of warriors united by a common tongue and a common threat. Theirs was not a march of conquest, but a solemn procession to a field of destiny. Every mile the Ottomans advanced, the Christian host grew, their resolve hardening with each step. Two immense forces, two faiths, two civilizations were now on a collision course, marching toward a small plain in the heart of Serbia, a place the locals called Kosovo Polje, the field of blackbirds. On the 14th of June, the two armies faced each other across the Lab River, the final barrier between them. As dusk bled across the sky, the vast plain of Kosovo became a tale of two cities, each teeming with tens of thousands of men awaiting the dawn. The Ottoman camp was a spectacle of disciplined order. The Sultan's great tent stood at its heart, a symbol of absolute authority. Around it, the Janissaries kept their silent, vigilant watch. The air hummed with the low murmur of Quranic recitation and the rhythmic clang of armourers making final preparations. Within his tent, Murad, now nearly 60, knelt in prayer. He was a veteran of countless campaigns, a man who had lived his life by the sword. He prayed not just for victory, but for a greater glory, to die a martyr in the service of his faith and his empire. He felt the weight of his dynasty, the future of his sons, Bayezid and Yaqub, who commanded his wings. Across the river, the Christian camp was a more chaotic, impassioned affair. Hundreds of campfires flickered like defiant stars against the encroaching darkness. Priests moved among the men, offering blessings and communion. Here, Prince Lazar held his final council. The air was thick with bravado, but also with a palpable tension. According to legend, Lazar was visited by an angel in a dream, offering him a choice: an earthly kingdom, secured by victory, or a heavenly kingdom, earned through martyrdom and the sacrifice of his army. His choice would seal their fate. For the common soldier on either side, the night was an eternity. They sharpened their blades, wrote letters home they knew might never be sent, and looked to the heavens, wondering if they would see another sunrise. The air grew heavy with anticipation, a silence pregnant with the violence to come. On the field of blackbirds, history held its breath. Dawn broke on June 15th, 1389, a date that would be seared into the memory of nations. As the morning mist lifted from Kosovo Polje, it revealed a terrifying tableau: two immense armies arrayed for battle. The Ottoman line was a crescent of disciplined steel. Sultan Murad, flanked by his elite Janissary guard, commanded the centre. On his right, his impetuous and brilliant son, Bayezid, held the Anatolian troops. On his left, his other son, Yaqub, commanded the forces from Rumelia. In front of them, a line of archers stood ready, 1,000 bows drawn as one. Opposite them, the Balkan coalition prepared for a single, cataclysmic charge. Prince Lazar held the Serbian center, while his son-in-law Vuk Branković commanded the right, and the formidable Bosnian general Vlatko Vuković led the left wing. Their strength lay in their heavy cavalry, a wall of armoured nobles who believed they could shatter the Ottoman line in one thunderous assault. The battle began not with a subtle manoeuvre, but with a roar that shook the earth. The Balkan knights charged. It was a sight of terrible majesty, a wave of iron and faith, lances lowered, banners streaming. They crashed into the Ottoman left flank with incredible force. Yakub's Rumelian troops, less experienced than their Anatolian counterparts, buckled under the onslaught. The Bosnian knights, led by Vuković, carved deep into the Ottoman lines, the momentum of their charge seemingly unstoppable. For a moment, it appeared the Christian strategy would succeed. The Ottoman left wing was in disarray, folding back upon itself. But the Ottoman centre, where Murad watched with an unflinching gaze, held firm. The Janissaries, an immovable rock in a sea of chaos, stood their ground, their disciplined volleys of arrows sowing death among the charging knights. The battle had reached its first bloody crisis. The initial decisive blow had been struck, but the heart of the dragon still beat strong. The sun sets on the field of blackbirds, June 15th, 1389. The clash of steel has faded, replaced by a sound more terrible, the collective moan of thousands of dying men. The air, thick with the metallic tang of blood and the dust of 1,000 frantic hooves, begins to cool. This is the landscape of victory for Sultan Murad I. His Ottoman army, though battered and bloodied, stands triumphant. The grand coalition of Balkan princes, Serbs, Bosnians, Albanians, lies shattered, their leader, Prince Lazar, captured and soon to be executed. Murad, now in his 60s, a veteran of countless campaigns that have pushed the borders of his empire from Anatolia to the heart of Europe, dismounts his horse. He walks the field. This is not a parade of triumph, but a grim accounting. His gaze sweeps over the carnage. For every fallen Serb or Bosnian knight, there is a Ghazi warrior, a son of Anatolia or Rumelia, who will never see his home again. The Sultan, a devout man who saw his conquests as a holy duty, understood the price of destiny. He had transformed the Ottoman state, institutionalizing the Janissary Corps, establishing a capital in Europe at Edirne, and making vassals of Byzantine emperors. He was the architect of an empire, a sovereign whose name inspired fear and awe from the Danube to the Aegean. As he steps carefully between the bodies, his thoughts are not for the chroniclers or the poets. They are with the God who granted him this victory. He sees the twisted banners, the broken lances, the lifeless eyes staring into the darkening sky. Each body is a testament to his ambition, a brick in the foundation of his dynasty. In this moment, he is more than a conqueror. He is a patriarch surveying the terrible cost of his family's future. He feels the weariness of 3 decades of rule, the weight of the crown, the burden of the sword. The victory is absolute, his authority unquestioned. He is at the zenith of his power, surrounded by the silence of the dead, unaware that his own final silence is only moments away. Within the relative order of the Sultan's command tent, the air of victory is cautious. The battle is won, but the field is not yet secure. Suddenly, a commotion arises at the perimeter. Guards drag forward a Serbian knight, his armor battered, his face a mask of desperation. He claims to be Miloš Obilić, a nobleman with vital intelligence, wishing to defect and accept Islam. He insists on delivering his message to the Sultan in person, to kneel before him and kiss his hand in submission. Murad's commanders are wary. To allow an armed enemy knight into the Sultan's presence is a breach of all protocol. They argue he should be searched, disarmed, even kept at a distance. But Murad, perhaps flush with the divine certainty of his victory, or perhaps wishing to display the magnanimity of a true conqueror, overrules them. He sees not a threat, but a symbol. The submission of a noble enemy knight would be the final seal on his triumph. He gestures for the man to be brought forward. Obilić is led into the tent. The flickering lamplight catches the exhaustion and grim resolve in his eyes. He approaches the seated sultan, a giant of history, the man who had crushed his people's hopes. He begins to kneel, as if in fealty, bowing his head low towards the sultan's hand. This is the moment, the assassin's kiss. In one fluid, desperate motion, born of a suicidal resolve, Obelich rises not with reverence, but with a poisoned dagger he had concealed in his garments. He lunges upward, plunging the blade deep into the sultan's abdomen. A collective gasp freezes the tent. For an instant, there is only disbelief. The conqueror of Adrianople, the victor of Maritza and Kosovo, looks down at the hilt protruding from his body, a look of profound shock on his face. The spell of invincibility is broken. The sultan, the shadow of God on earth, slumps to the ground, mortally wounded by a single audacious act of betrayal. The assassination of a sultan on the field of victory is an event without precedent. It is a cataclysm that threatens to unravel the entire Ottoman enterprise. As Murad I breathes his last, chaos erupts. The victorious army is suddenly a headless beast, vulnerable to panic, or worse, a renewed enemy assault. In this moment of supreme crisis, one man moves with preternatural speed and chilling clarity: Prince Bayezid. He had commanded the right wing of the army during the battle, fighting with a ferocity that would later earn him the epithet Yildirim, the thunderbolt. Now, he strikes again, not at the enemy, but at the heart of the Ottoman power structure. His first act is to secure the scene. The assassin is cut down immediately. The Sultan's death is concealed from the rank-and-file troops to prevent a collapse in morale. His second act is far darker, a move dictated by the brutal logic of Ottoman succession. He knows that his brother, Yaqub Çelebi, who had commanded the left wing with equal valor, is now his rival for the throne. A civil war, fought here and now between two princes on a battlefield in a hostile land, would mean the end of everything their father had built. There is no time for sentiment, only for survival. Bayezid summons Yaqub to the command tent, under the pretext of receiving their father's final orders. Unsuspecting, Yaqub arrives to see not his father, but an assembly of grim-faced commanders loyal to Bayezid. There is no trial, no debate. By Bayezid's order, Yaqub is seized and strangled with a silk bowstring, the customary execution for Ottoman royalty, to avoid the spilling of blood. In the space of a few hours, Bayezid loses a father and murders a brother. But in doing so, he becomes the undisputed sultan. The crisis is averted through an act of supreme ruthlessness. The thunder has sounded, and a new, more terrible reign has begun. The Ottoman army did not shatter. Under the iron fist of the new sultan, Bayezid I, it completed the victory, routed the remaining forces, and began the long, solemn march back to Edirne. They carried with them the viscera of their murdered sultan, buried on the field of Kosovo in a modest tomb, and his embalmed body, destined for a grand mausoleum in his first capital, Bursa. Murad's legacy was now twofold. In stone, he left an empire transformed. He was the true founder of Ottoman Europe, a patron of architecture who filled Bursa and Edirne with mosques, schools, and bridges that declared the permanent arrival of his dynasty. He had created the Janissaries, a slave army loyal only to him, an institution that would be the backbone of Ottoman military power for centuries. He had taken a Ghazi emirate and forged it into a disciplined, bureaucratic, and expansionist empire. Yet, the manner of his death wrote a second legacy, one in blood. His assassination became a foundational myth for his enemies. For the Serbs and other Balkan peoples, Miloš Obilić was instantly transformed from an assassin into a martyr hero, the ultimate symbol of defiance against an unstoppable tide. The Battle of Kosovo itself, a catastrophic military defeat, was reframed in national law as a moral victory, a sacred sacrifice to defend Christendom. Murad's death, intended to decapitate the Ottoman state, instead ensured its continuity through the brutal accession of Bayezid. But it also planted the seeds of a narrative of resistance that would be nurtured for 600 years, fueling uprisings and shaping modern national identities. The conqueror had won his final battle, but his death on the field ensured that the war of memory, of myth, and of identity had only just begun. He was a builder in stone, but his final unintended act was to become a martyr for two opposing worlds.